When I arrived in Tokyo in 1988, Japanese real estate was reputed to be the most expensive on earth. One of the most memorable stories was that the land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was worth more than the entire state of California. And at the time, the idea of an expat, even the most rich expat, buying a home in Japan was ludicrous. It was laughable. But over the last 22 years, Japanese land prices have fallen in yen terms, but prices have also fallen in relation to Hong Kong, to London and New York, and even Sydney for that matter. And that makes a pied-à-terre in Tokyo a very real possibility for many people. Today, Japanese real estate is, in a word, cheap. Several factors make Japan interesting. First, unlike Hong Kong and China, Japanese real estate is very near or at the bottom of the cycle. And there are no restrictions on foreigners buying land, buying homes, or buying investment properties in Japan. Mortgages are available from international and from domestic lenders. And the Bank of Japan's zero interest rate policy, which it reaffirmed in October, looks like it's going to make financing inexpensive for some time to come. Sentiment seems to be turning as well. Declines in the prices of residential land have slowed. And in September, Japan's largest casualty insurer, Tokyo Marine, announced plans to invest 50 billion yen, or about $600 million US, in residential real estate. So those are positive signs. Finally, despite a steady stream of negative news from the Japanese and international media, Japan remains the world's second or third largest economy, depending on what day it is. It has an educated workforce, advanced technologies, and a history of overcoming challenges like currency appreciation and spikes in oil prices. Recently, Japan ranked 11th in the United Nations Human Development Index, ahead of Switzerland and France, not to mention Hong Kong and Singapore. So, is this a good time to buy Japanese real estate? I believe it is. As a matter of fact, on Monday I closed on an apartment in Tokyo. But if you're going to buy, you really need to understand the demographic trends that are underpinning Japan, and you need to understand the quirks of the Japanese real estate market, and there are lots of quirks there. Let's start with the demographics. As the 19th century French philosopher Auguste Comte noted, demography is destiny, and nowhere is this more true than the Japanese housing market, which is being shaped by four key trends: a population that's aging, a population that's shrinking, a growing number of small households, and widespread migration to big cities. As a result of these trends, some neighborhoods and some types of property are going to do a lot better than others in the years ahead. Nationwide, 1 person in 5 is now over age 65, and a quarter of the population will be over 75 by 2025. Over 89% of Japan's elderly own their own homes, and most of those homes are freestanding houses. Those houses were bought or built for young growing families, and as a result they're completely inappropriate for their current inhabitants. As a result of that, there is a glut of large old homes on the market. When elderly people buy or rent a home, they want to be close to train or subway stations, and they also prefer apartment buildings with elevators rather than long flights of stairs for obvious reasons. Proximity to hospitals, entertainment and social services is, if you're an elderly person, a lot more important than having a school nearby. Elderly people also want what's called universal design, which incorporates things like large light switches, wide doorways, and wheelchair ramps, features that at this point are still relatively rare in Japan. Across the country, households are shrinking, and that trend is being driven by higher rates of divorce, although it's come off a peak a few years ago. The numbers are still up. Underemployed young men who can't afford to get married, and smaller families among those who do marry. Also, older people, unlike previous generations, are living apart from their kids, so that makes for more households. As a result, cozy dwellings that are cheaper to occupy and to maintain are likely to retain their value better than large old homes. Japan's population is expected to drop from about 127 million today to between 90 and 102 million by 2050. The likelihood of that trend reversing is roughly nil. Japan has virtually no immigration to speak of, and the birth rate has been flat or falling for about the last 20 years. Some experts believe that the official population projections are actually wildly optimistic because they're very political, and that empty playgrounds like this one are going to be a very common sight throughout Japan for years to come. Obviously, a smaller population means less demand for housing, And smart investors are going to buy in locations where people want to live. Increasingly, that means the Tokyo metropolitan area, which includes Kanagawa, Saitama, and Chiba, which are prefectures that surround Tokyo. To a lesser degree, Osaka and Nagoya are net beneficiaries of this trend as well. As Japan's commercial, administrative, educational, and cultural hub, Tokyo is a magnet for talent. If you're a young person, you move to Tokyo. And that was borne out in the statistics last year. 117,000 new residents moved to Tokyo in 2009. That same year, 37 of Japan's 47 prefectures reported net outmigration. Hokkaido lost 12,000 people, and that's on the back of losing 20,000 the year before. The people who are left behind tend to be older people like retirees who are actually drawing from pensions rather than paying for it and are unlikely to start families or start businesses. So that means you want to be very careful buying anything outside of Japan's large cities. Each of these trends obviously is going to influence the price you pay for property today and the price that you'll receive when you or your heirs sell that property in future. So let's look at some of the quirks that make the Japanese market unique. In any country, Canada, Hong Kong, the United States, buying a home is a classic case of what economists call information asymmetry. You might buy 1 or 2 apartments in your lifetime, but when you do, you'll work with an agent who's got an intimate knowledge of the neighborhood. You'll work with a lender who knows the mortgage market inside and out and all the clauses buried in the mortgage documentation. And you'll buy from a vendor who knows the flaws and defects of that property, including the crazy old lady upstairs who likes to entertain till 4 o'clock in the morning. In short, everybody in this process knows more than you do. And that puts you at a big disadvantage, a disadvantage that grows if you're operating in a foreign language and dealing with unfamiliar laws and customs. If you're an overseas buyer, there's several things to consider before you take the plunge. One is the yen, which is now near 15-year highs against the US dollars. Despite that strength, though, the Economist Big Mac Index estimates that the yen is only 5% overvalued. Many large Japanese exporters are now using 90 yen to the dollar as their expected exchange rate for the year ahead. And as the Americans and Europeans continue to devalue their currencies, I believe that the Japanese yen is going to stay strong for the short to medium term. Financing is another big issue. Despite the low default rate on home loans, large Japanese banks have been reluctant to extend mortgage to foreign buyers, particularly if they're not permanent residents. And non-Japanese buyers are often shocked to discover that their overseas credit history is of absolutely no interest to Japanese lenders. Fortunately, this situation is changing. Some mid-sized local banks like Shinsei and Suruga actively market home loans to foreign borrowers, as do international lenders like National Australia Bank and HSBC. However, these loans carry restrictions on the borrower's age, on the property's use, and on its location. As a rule of thumb, it's a whole lot easier to get a mortgage on a new condo in downtown Tokyo than it is on a ski chalet in Hokkaido. International lenders will often pre-approve your loan and also use English language application forms. But the sale and purchase agreement and other documents will be in Japanese, and those translations, if you actually get them, are not legally binding. They're only there for your information. Fortunately, most transactions use standard forms that are provided by an organization like the Association of Japanese Real Estate Agents. For both domestic and international buyers, however, one of the biggest challenges is the lack of pricing information in Japan. Here in Hong Kong, you can enter an address into one particular bank's website and almost instantly get an estimated mortgage value for that property. Large real estate agents, if you go to their websites, have asking prices for apartments and also actual transaction prices. And if you go to the land registry for a few bucks, you can get a transcript that will show you how much the previous owner paid for the property, and as well as any outstanding encumbrances or orders from the buildings department. Japan, on the other hand, is at the other end of the transparency spectrum. While the government recently launched an online transaction registry, the data only goes back to 2005, and it is not comprehensive. There's a lot of holes in it. Japan does have the Real Estate Information Network System, otherwise known as RAINS, which is roughly analogous to what you might find in Canada and the US with a multiple listing service, but RAINS is not available to mere mortals like us. You have to be a real estate agent to get at it. And that lack of transparency is expensive. One study estimated that the average person buying a used condo in Japan spends 1,000,000 yen on search costs, like, for example, going to open houses. Another difference is the attitude towards used homes. In Japan, consumers are famous for liking new things, and pre-owned homes are not new things. In fact, pre-owned homes represent just 13% of sales, compared with 78% in the US and 89% in Britain. On average, Japanese homes are demolished after about 30 years versus 55 years in the US and 77 years in the UK. As a result, a home that would be halfway through its usable lifespan in the West is ready for the wrecking ball in Japan. Many old buildings actually have negative value because if you buy them, you have to pay somebody to demolish them and haul away the rubble before you can rebuild. Long working hours and short building lifespans mean that do-it-yourself home maintenance, like you would have, for example, in Canada or the UK, is relatively uncommon in Japan, and that can lead to maintenance problems in pre-owned homes. You may also have trouble finding an inspector to come in and do a proper survey of the home before you buy it. Because old homes and condos are unpopular with local buyers, you can sometimes find bargains. But seismic retrofitting is optional. So you want to avoid homes built before the construction standards were tightened in 1981. Standards were raised again in 2000 when the Housing Quality Assurance Act and 10-year warranties were introduced. So that's another date to pay attention to if you're buying a used home. And beware of projects associated with a gentleman named Hidetsugu Aneha. He faked design data for 99 buildings in the Tokyo area, including this condo. Aneha-san is doing a 5-year term in jail right now. He ruined a lot of people's lives because people bought these houses, bought these condos, and basically got stuck paying mortgages on property they couldn't inhabit. And it's a tragedy because the mortgages were large and basically the properties were uninhabitable. Concerns about climate change have prompted the government to promote construction of more durable houses that can be renovated and resold. But this is a relatively recent initiative, and much of the housing stock is still built to that 30-year spec. The government also offers tax breaks and other incentives to encourage the use of things like double glazing and solar cells. And given Japan's reliance on imported energy, that can only be a good thing. As I mentioned, you can buy investment property in Japan. However, there's been a real glut of office space in Japan for many years. And commercial real estate, which is typically sold on an en bloc or multi-floor basis, the returns on that property has been absolutely miserable. So you'd probably be further ahead to look at residential property. Recently, Goldman Sachs announced that they were walking away from an investment in the Tiffany building in Ginza. And if Goldman Sachs can't make money on commercial property, then again, us mere mortals probably don't have a lot of chance either. If you are going to buy residential property, though, be sure to study or spend a little bit of time learning about Japan's tenant protection laws. Key money and other uniquely Japanese customs make it very expensive to rent a home in Japan. But once you're in as a tenant, particularly if you have one of the long-term leases, you've got a lot of legal protection. Fortunately, most Japanese property disputes are settled through negotiation, and rarely do they go to court. But because Japan's legal system is relatively opaque and it tends to focus on maintaining social harmony, legal issues tend to be less clear-cut than they are in places like the West. Buying and selling real estate in Japan is a real hands-on process. And for most transactions, a simple sale and purchase agreement, which is a little bit like a Hong Kong tax form, it's only 4 or 5 pages long, is complemented by a document called the Explanation of Important Matters. And a licensed real estate will actually read this document out to you in person, although you can also do it over Skype, before the S&P agreement is executed. It can take several hours to get through the Explanation of Important Matters. I have heard of people saying it can be done in 30 minutes for a plain vanilla transaction. I also had one real estate agent tell me he went through one where it took 11 and a half hours to get through it, which is a bit of an ordeal. That covers everything from the payment schedule to the warranty term. So it's a very, very detailed thing. And as I said, that's read out loud. The title transfer is actually handled by a specialist lawyer called a judicial scrivener who submits the documents to the land registry at the Legal Affairs Bureau. And this is significant because in Japan, land and buildings are separate legal entities and they're registered separately. And that allows for homes and condos to be built on leased land. Now, the leased land is typically held under anything from a 30 to a 50-year lease, not the 999-year lease that you might be familiar with in the UK or in Hong Kong. And this is particularly important because it's very easy to go to Tokyo and to buy a condo that's on leased land. And the building has basically got no value. All the value is in the land. So that's something that you probably would want to avoid. And you would be willing, I would recommend that you ask if you're looking at a property to make sure that the land is, in fact, a share of the land is included in the property. Watch out too for natural hazards. Japan is famous for its earthquakes, but the risks are not uniformly distributed across the country. Japan was also the site of the deadliest landslide in human history that killed over 15,000 people back in Shimabara City in 1792. Most years, landslides kill more people in Japan than earthquakes do. It's when the big ones like the Great Kanto quake or the Kobe quake happen that you get large-scale casualties. Typhoons and floods are another threat. About 20% of Tokyo lies below the normal high water mark, and that makes the city vulnerable to storm surges and tsunamis. Fortunately, the ward offices can provide you with detailed flood maps where you can actually see the floodplains in the area. So it's relatively easy to avoid that sort of a hazard. But there are also man-made hazards. For example, about 1/3 of the nation's former manufacturing sites are actually in urban areas and are contaminated with lead, arsenic, and other toxic heavy metals. Tens of thousands of tons of polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, which are a known carcinogen, are in storage awaiting treatment. And they have to be by law treated by 2016 unless they push the laws out. And asbestos was used in Japanese building as recently as 2006. Japan also has a large nuclear power industry that has, to be blunt, an abysmal safety record. Don't take my word for it. Google Monju, M-O-N-J-U, or Rokasho, and you'll see just how bad their safety record is. And that's obviously very ironic given Japan's history. I don't want to overstate these threats, but if I was going to buy a home there, I'd want to know who my neighbors are and I'd want to know where the threats are. You would also want to do careful due diligence if you want to buy a foreclosed property. And the downturn that began in the fall of 2008 prompted a spike in the number of foreclosures. And those homes, like foreclosures in a lot of places, sell at large discounts. There are companies out there that will help foreigners buy foreclosed property. And if you speak Japanese, you can actually deal with the courts yourself and short-circuit the process. Discounts on these homes are greater in rural areas and in secondary cities than they are in desirable places like Tokyo. But if you're going to buy a foreclosure, you need cash because lenders rarely provide financing for foreclosed homes. Also, you can't inspect the inside of these homes before you buy, although you may be able to see photos beforehand. And many properties have tenants, some of whom may in fact be Yakuza. Finally, and perhaps most important, most of the foreclosures have been picked over by professional investors looking for low-hanging fruit before they reach the market. You can find bargains, but anybody who tells you that there's one on every street corner is probably exaggerating a little bit. And they're particularly rare in very desirable places like Azabu in Tokyo. Rural areas and secondary cities that offer clean air and affordable space are another good source of bargains. But both are suffering from the effects of migration to Tokyo and other large cities. And depopulation in these areas has been made worse by the closure of large manufacturing plants, many of which are moving offshore to places like China to escape high wage costs and the soaring yen. When these factories close, skilled jobs disappear and they rarely return. In the past, the national government financed rail lines, highways, dams, and other large infrastructure projects in rural areas. And these projects provided much-needed construction jobs that helped to sustain the local economy. However, many of these projects are now being reviewed, scaled back, or canceled, adding to the economic uncertainty in these areas. As local governments run out of money, they're shutting schools and hospitals. Railway lines, airports, ferry routes, and even gas stations in rural areas are closing. And there's a nationwide shortage of doctors in Japan. One estimate I read recently said they were short about 24,000 doctors nationwide, and that problem is particularly acute in rural areas because doctors want to live in big cities. There's a very real possibility that these cutbacks in rural areas could create a vicious circle where lower service levels cause more people to leave, reducing the tax base and causing even more cutbacks. And these problems affect communities throughout Japan, including places like Yubari in Hokkaido. Yubari is probably the poster child for Japanese rural problems. It's a former coal mining center where the population fell from about 110,000 in 1960 to less than 12,000 today. Yubari was the first city in Japan to declare bankruptcy with debts of about 332 billion yen. So that's about 400 million US dollars. And Yubari is in bad shape. Its problems have been covered at length in the Japanese media, and they make sobering reading for anybody thinking about buying a rural home or a recreational property. Many of Japan's resorts are surrounded by areas that are suffering from similar economic problems. That said, however, if you have a long investing horizon, rural areas offer some intriguing opportunities. It's no secret that Japan's farmers are retiring and dying off, and that few of their children want to work the family farm. By 2005, some 400,000 hectares of farmland in Japan had been abandoned, and that's roughly twice the size of the Tokyo metropolitan area. It's a huge amount of land. Japan's farms are tiny. On average, they're about 1/20th the size of a German farm and about 1% the size of an American farm. That small size makes them inefficient, and many farmers depend on subsidies to survive. As the number of farmers decreases and young people continue to flock to big cities like Tokyo and Yokohama, the political influence of rural areas will continue to decrease. At some point, I'm guessing probably around the middle of the century, the cost of subsidizing farmers and rural municipalities is going to become unsustainable. Eventually, the government will allow and ultimately encourage the consolidation of Japan's small holdings and the introduction of wholesale corporate farming. I hasten to emphasize, this is not going to happen tomorrow. This is something that's going to happen in the future, because there are powerful government, agricultural, and community groups that have an interest in maintaining the status quo. But it's going to happen, and it will be driven by advances in technology as well as international trade and political forces. For example, today, biotechnology and robotics are being used to boost the efficiency of Japanese farms, and Japan is slowly warming to the idea of joining a Pacific Rim free trade agreement. Companies like Family Mart have recently announced plans to grow food in Japan and sell it in China. So change is slowly starting to happen. But the wholesale restructuring of the agricultural sector is a long way off. So if you want to buy in Japan today, where should you buy? Well, let's start with location. I think Tokyo is going to benefit from the internal migration that I mentioned earlier, and I don't think that trend is going to abate anytime soon. I'd buy in Tokyo's 23 wards, near one of the main commuter lines that go through Shibuya, Shinjuku, Ueno, or Shinagawa for that matter, indicated with black stars here. The area inside the Yamanote train line, which circles central Tokyo and is shown in black here, has a lot of upmarket neighborhoods if you're looking for a place to live in Tokyo. But there are also attractive values in working class wards like Adachi-ku and Itabashi-ku, where I recently purchased an apartment. In Japan, nearly everybody uses public transit, so a home near a train or a subway line is always a good bet. But don't forget to check the neighborhood's flood and earthquake maps. Small apartments obviously are going to benefit from the demographic trends I mentioned earlier, especially if they have elderly-friendly designs, but be sure that the property is on owned, not leased land. For self-use, newer flats have got better earthquake resistance and higher energy efficiency, whereas older apartments are usually fully depreciated and offer higher rental yields. Finally, a word of caution. There's lots of inexpensive property in Japan, and when something is unusually cheap, there's often a very good reason for it, whether it's a nearby cemetery, a major structural repair project that's overdue for the building, or a new freeway plan for the neighborhood. That said, there are good values in Japan, and with a little bit of research you can own a home, an income property, or a distinctive vacation home in a country that, until recently, was beyond the reach of all but the richest investors. Thank you. And now I'd be happy to take your questions.